October 3, 1965, marks the 50th anniversary of the Immigration and Reform Act of 1965. American immigration policy from 1921 to 1965 restricted immigration by race and ethnicity from Europe, Asia, and Africa by setting strict quotas based on country of origin, using the Census of 1890 as the base. In the early 1960s, there was a backlog of about 800,000 people from Europe seeking to enter the United States, primarily from four nations: Portugal, Greece, Italy, and Poland, with family members in this country. Congressman Emanuel Celler, Democrat from Brooklyn, who voted against the restrictive 1924 National Origins Act, or Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, favored changing the law and won the support of our only Irish Catholic president, John Kennedy. However, JFK's murder in 1963 left the issue for the new president, Lyndon Johnson. Supporters of reform wanted to remove the discrimination of the previous legislation, and in the era of civil rights reform, changing immigration policy appeared appropriate to liberals and the congressional members who were descended from Southern and East European immigrants. Southern Democrats, like Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, favored continuing the restrictions and feared that once the barriers were removed, a flood of immigrants from Asia, Africa, and Latin America would follow the backlog Europeans. The Polish government limited emigration, so relatively few Polish immigrants benefited from the new legislation. But immigrants from Italy, Greece, and Portugal rebuilt immigrant neighborhoods and rejuvenated some urban areas. For example, immigrants from Portugal established new businesses and bought homes in the ironbound section of Newark, New Jersey. Advocates of reform expected that immigrants would come primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. The 1965 reform emphasized family reunification as one of the priorities for admission and exempted the immediate relatives of American citizens, native-born or naturalized, from the country quotas. Conservatives wanted to limit immigration to 200,000 per year, and liberals favored 500,000. President Johnson urged compromise at 290,000, split between 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere and 170,000 from the rest of the world. This was the first time a limit was placed on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, leading to a new problem. Mexicans routinely came to the United States to work, and the Bracero program from 1942 to 1964 allowed employers to recruit large numbers of Mexican workers. However, the end of the Bracero program, with the 20,000 limit on immigrants per country, created an incentive for Mexicans to cross the border illegally, looking for work since employers wanted their labor. The family reunification provision allowed for an increase of non-quota immigration of families, increasing the total number of legal immigrants beyond 290,000 a year. By 1975, the backlog of European immigrants ended, and since 1975, most immigrants have come from Asia or Latin America, exactly the fear of Senator Ervin, further altering the nature of the American population. Total numbers of immigrants have varied from year to year because of the exemptions from the quota numbers for certain immigrant categories, like relatives of American citizens or highly skilled immigrants. In 1963, when President Lyndon Johnson assumed office upon the murder of President Kennedy, Johnson told Henry Cabot Lodge that, "I am not going to lose Vietnam. I am not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went." Johnson informed the Vietnamese that he would provide whatever aid they need to defeat the communists, but at the same time he refused to commit American ground troops. During the 1964 presidential campaign, he argued on August 16, 1964, that some others are eager to enlarge the conflict. They call upon us to supply American boys to the job that Asian boys should do. Republican candidate for the presidency Barry Goldwater criticized the Johnson policy as a no-win policy, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff pressured the president to escalate the American role. Initially, Johnson resisted the pressure and publicly campaigned against enlarging the war by bombing North Vietnam or sending American combat troops. After the election, President Johnson came under increasing pressure from civilian and military advisors to make bolder moves to save South Vietnam. The groundwork for escalating the American involvement began during the election campaign. In August 1964, American destroyers escorting South Vietnamese ships confronted North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Johnson argued that the North Vietnamese attacked the destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy. He asked Congress for an authorization to use military force to protect American military forces in Vietnam. Only 2 senators dissented. Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon warned, "We are giving the president war-making powers in the absence of a declaration of war." Ignoring the concerns of Morse, the Senate, by a vote of 87-2, passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president the authority to use military force. This became the blank check for the escalation of the American military involvement in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Neither President Johnson nor his successor Richard Nixon went back to Congress for a second authorization to use force, and we never declared war on North Vietnam. Unlike the Korean War and the Gulf War, we did not have the authorization of the United Nations to provide international backing for our use of military force. The war in Vietnam raised the questions of presidents waging war without a declaration of war, and what are the constitutional powers of Congress. President Johnson began limited attacks on military targets in North Vietnam under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing the president to appear both firm in protecting American national interests and moderate in his response compared to calls for stronger action from Barry Goldwater. By early 1965, American advisors and the Joint Chiefs of Staff informed the president of the deterioration of the military situation in Vietnam. In February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked American advisors' barracks at Pleiku, killing 9 Americans and wounding 60. Johnson authorized the use of aerial attacks on North Vietnam in retaliation. President Johnson wanted to make clear to the Russians and Chinese that the United States would not tolerate the attacks on American personnel. Vietnam would not be LBJ's Bay of Pigs. As a carrot, he proposed $1 billion in aid to construct a Mekong River equivalent of the TVA if the North Vietnamese ended their support of the Viet Cong and urged an end to the insurgency in South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese government ignored the president's proposal, and the Viet Cong continued to attack American advisors. In retaliation, the president authorized continued air attacks on North Vietnam and agreed to send combat troops. The air campaign did not deter North Vietnam, but proved popular at home and neutralized Republican attacks that LBJ was too soft on the communists. In March 1965, the first 1,500 combat troops went to protect the base at Da Nang. By May, the American troop presence grew to 50,000, and the president agreed to their use in combat, officially changing the American role from advising to sharing the combat role with the South Vietnamese. The American presence continued to increase, so by the end of 1965, over 200,000 American soldiers arrived in Vietnam. President Johnson did not ask Congress to approve the additional troops. When Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times met with North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh in December 1966, Ho asked, "How long did the Americans want to fight? 1 year, 5, 10, 20? We will be glad to accommodate you." By this point, the United States had 360,000 troops in Vietnam. It increased to 485,000 troops by the end of 1967 and peaked at 543,000 in early 1968. In January 1968, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. Although the United States and South Vietnam defeated the North Vietnamese offensive, it destroyed the credibility of the Johnson administration's claims of victory in Vietnam. Images of the war demoralized advisors in Washington. Many of the civilian and military advisors to the president no longer claimed an easy victory. Two candidates, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota and Robert Kennedy of New York, decided to do the most unusual in American politics: challenge a sitting president for the 1968 presidential nomination, especially since Johnson won a huge majority in 1964 over Goldwater. These challenges, combined with events in Vietnam, led President Johnson to announce he would seek negotiations to end the war, and he would retire from the presidency at the end of his term, creating an open race for the 1968 Democratic nomination. President Johnson's decision not to run again in 1968 shocked the public and created one of the major surprises in American political history.